Welcome everyone to the June 22nd, 2020 Tanho Monday Textual Study. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson of Early Christian Texts, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study, we'll be talking about gender creativity and problems in the Gospel of Thomas. This text is full of gender issues. Besides its fascinating creativity in general, and specifically in its approaches to gender, we'll note how fluid and flexible these ideas are. Just a gentle reminder that donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. $5 to $10 per session is enough to keep us going. You can find the donation link, more information about past and future study sessions, as well as other archived recordings on the Early Christian Texts website by clicking the button on the home page that says Tanho Monday Textual Studies. So now, Hal, I can't wait to hear what you've got to tell us.
Thanks so much, Shirley, for all of your leadership, and thanks everybody for being here this evening. So yes, as usual, we've bitten off more than we can chew, I think, this evening. But it seems to me that the questions and possibilities and interests that are inherent in the Gospel of Thomas have been long underlooked or caricaturized. And so what I'm hoping is that we can lay out a bunch of different possibilities for thinking about gender in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, I don't want to presume that all of you know a lot about the Gospel of Thomas. We always have such a wonderful spread of folks in our Monday night studies. So let me just say a very few things about the Gospel of Thomas before we jump into other things. First of all, before I do that, I will remind those of you who are here and those of you who've just been here recently that it's my, the way I learn most is in conversation. And so I want to warn you that I won't be doing a lot of lecturing and generally don't. So I'll expect you to come to the floor with questions, protests, thoughts of your own. And we're pretty sure that we can depend on that being very good material for all of our thoughts. So please do not hesitate. And to say it another way, I'm really ravenous for your thoughts and your responses to this material. I do have some abilities also to make sure that none of us go on and on. So please jump in as much as you can. So the first thing, again, to say just a very little bit about the Gospel of Thomas, because this evening won't be primarily about an introduction to the Gospel of Thomas, but we'll be looking at the specific topic of gender within the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is one of the most popular texts that have been discovered in the last 100 years in early Christ movements, and it has just, I don't know, there must be like 30 or 40 books written on the Gospel of Thomas in the last 15 years. It's really very dramatic in what it can mean for a lot of different people. We don't know really for sure when the Gospel of Thomas was written. I think the range is from about 50 to 175 CE. I would tend to put it Let me say it this way. I would tend to say that the one copy we have of the Gospel of Thomas from the Nag Hammadi library, I think that it was probably written around 80. However, I'm fairly sure that those who would push it earlier, if they would say it's another version, an earlier version of the Gospel of Thomas, you could get it pretty far back to 50 or 60. What is clear, even from the text we have, is that that text is continually being rewritten. So we're fairly sure that there are later versions of the Gospel of Thomas, and that the project of the Gospel of Thomas itself is to not have a finished book, but have a book that keeps going. Does not hear just the Jesus from yesteryear, but the Jesus from tomorrow. And so what one then also would want to ask, since it's called the Gospel of Thomas, whether Thomas wrote it. Nobody knows. It looks like Thomas is a fairly important figure in this text. They want to know who he is, as well as who Jesus is, as well as who James is. The thing I would probably want to say about the author of the Gospel of Thomas is it's not just one person. In fact, the more you look at just one saying, any saying, you realize that this is probably a community project, and probably a community project across a whole bunch of time. So you can call the author Thomas, but probably that would be only metaphor. We don't really know where it was written. But it looks like fairly quickly it became very important in two places. One would be Syria, the other would be Egypt. No, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the who's in a minute, but let me stop here and see if anyone has a comment or a question about just the basics of the Gospel of Thomas.
And let me just say that I put everybody on mute, so if you want to speak up, please unmute yourself to speak. Go ahead, Judy. Yeah.
I read in the Nag Hammadi version of the scripture, in the intro to it, that there was some talk about Thomas being Judas Thomas, the twin, the brother of Jesus, Jesus' twin brother. I'd never heard that before. Can you give me some more about that possibility?
Yeah, so Thomas, the words, the Greco-Coptic words used for Thomas actually mean twin, or partially mean twin. So yeah, Thomas is twin par excellence. Thomas is not the only person in the early Christ movements who people write about as Jesus's twin. So Jesus's twin is a kind of a spiritual metaphor to a certain extent. So one should think about being a twin of Jesus is an excessive intimacy. It's not necessarily about historical genealogy. So this is mostly, I would say, about the intimacy of Thomas and Jesus, and we may return to that when we talk about gender as well. So being a twin is a spiritual path, not just with Jesus, but with a whole bunch of other, especially other sages or wisdom teachers. So that's kind of a punting, Judy.
Thank you. So it's not intended to mean a physical twin brother.
Well, yeah, this is, again, I'm immediately wrong. Your response is really wonderful. I would want to say that if after I said that, you said that, the person who thinks they are Jesus's twin would say, "Of course, I'm the real twin."
I'm going to have to think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other thoughts about kind of basics? Well, let's jump in, and I want to start. Well, the other thing to say about Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, I think, is that it is, of course, one of these very early extra-canonical texts that calls itself a gospel, and that is, and so, as far as I'm concerned, since the word gospel isn't used in some of the other canonical terms, it's really, one has to honor it being a gospel. But the word gospel is not a defined word in the first and second century. It just simply means good news. And it does have some technical terms, or technical meanings, and those are good news brought to someone by someone important. So, for instance, the Caesars often say they're bringing good news, and they're often not. So that's a trick. So this is a gospel of all saying. So nothing happens in the Gospel of Thomas. It's Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, 114 times. No plot, just Jesus said. Or another way of saying this would be that being wise is enough for this book. Being with someone wise is enough for this book. Becoming wise is enough. In other words, you don't need to be saved. You don't need to have a story of someone who saves you. You don't need to have a God figure. Wisdom is enough. Sometimes many people, like the folks who write the Gospel of Thomas, will think that God can get into that mix. But this is all about speaking and listening to short little puzzling and redemptive sayings. So in other words, no story. Now here's where I want to talk a little bit about the what I would call the genre of wisdom. And that is a kind of literature that has existed really around the world for at least the last 5,000 years. Wisdom literature is a genre of humans coming to speech that first happened without any writing. So wisdom as a genre is basically women and men coming together to think out loud in short little pieces, and to let something happen to them in their relationship to the greater world, maybe to God, maybe to one another, in one speaking briefly to one another, then listening a lot, and then maybe somebody else will give a saying. That's what wisdom does. For instance, if those of you who are interested in the Bible, the book of Proverbs is a typical wisdom thing, in which you have these little proverbs that are also almost exactly, in terms of the size, almost exactly like what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. So this Gospel of Thomas is a classic wisdom piece. And by classic, I mean both typical and brilliant. And it very quickly became popular in the ancient world. It has become very popular in the last 50 years of our world as well. So I just want to say that about Jesus, the Gospel of Thomas, and wisdom, and stop there for a moment of thought from anyone. So I'll say another one thing and have a little bit more pause. Jesus being a wisdom teacher is not just the thought of the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus mostly acts like a wisdom teacher in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That is, Jesus speaks in these terse little sayings, parables, aphorisms, proverbs. And there, Jesus will mostly just say something and then be quiet. In other words, he doesn't build unlike, for instance, the Gospel of John, where Jesus more or less develops a long speech almost every time he starts talking. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Thomas, Jesus, for the most part, has a lot of teachings, but not a lot of long teachings. It's just a lot of short teachings meant to be thought about and talked about along the way. The other thing we need to say is that Paul, in 1 Corinthians, calls Jesus wisdom. In 1 Corinthians 2, a key part of who Paul thinks Jesus is wisdom. We could have a whole Monday night about that itself. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions because we're going to get on the edge of gender and Thomas almost the next thing out. But let's see if anybody else has something else to say.
Just a quick question. Because the Gospel of Thomas is wisdom sayings, does that make it more Jewish? Maybe Egyptian Jewish, the more kind of area over there than the more conventional orthodoxy that we have?
Oh, great question, Helen. And the answer is yes and no. Thoroughly yes and no. And let me say a little bit about that. So the genre of wisdom in Israel is very close to the genre of wisdom among Buddhist teachers, other teachers in the Middle East. They all are kind of very similar in the way they talk and in how they do it. The way they have students hanging around with them who are also learning to give wisdom sayings too. So in that regard, yes, you have a lot of wise guys in that was a laugh line. But you're muted, right? I can't hear you. But anyway, there are a lot of wise guys, meaning wise sages in Israel, who basically spend their life walking around talking to people in short sentences. But that really happens all across the Mediterranean, all across the Near East, and then you're deep into it in India, much of Asia, and China.
Hal, thank you for the fascinating insights on wisdom. And I'm wondering how Q and Thomas would be different in terms of collections of sayings and their approach to wisdom.
Well, thanks, Barry. Not much. Matter of fact, they share about a third of the material. Is the one thing. They're not the same thing, but they're the same genre. And the cool thing about both of them is that they are not in a narrative-based story. They're just sayings. So it's very much the same thing going on. The very wonderful thing is that that Thomas and Q aren't the same thing. In other words, we get more stuff. Q is, of course, within the canon on one level.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about gender. And let me say at the beginning of this that for me, one of the most alive dimensions of early Christ people's studies in the last 40 years is in gender. And so this is one of the most alive and brilliant parts of studies of the Bible and studies of early Christ movements of the first 2 centuries. So we're jumping in a really powerful and diverse and exciting enterprise. At the same time, I would want to say that gender studies is what used to be, for much of New Testament studies, what used to be called feminist studies. And what has happened in probably the last 25 years is that we have had some powerful things we've learned in feminism. And we've noticed that all that we want to be talking about may be better if we add the term gender to thinking in feminist terms as well. When I have been, and I've been working on gender and Thomas for quite a while, I need to tell you that as I was thinking in the last couple of weeks about it, I counted about 25 sayings that relate to gender in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, some of you have been reading it recently, so you might want to give another answer to that. But the first thing I want to do is stay a little bit on the edge of wisdom and the Gospel of Thomas for one reason. The genre of wisdom in the people of Israel has the person of wisdom too. Some of you who read the Bible, both in the New Testament and in the Hebrew Scriptures, will know that there is a fairly big person in the Bible who is called wisdom herself. She's probably best known in the book of Proverbs, where the first 9 chapters are about her. She is a female divine character related to the God of Israel. In a lot of ways, for instance, in Hebrews, not in the Hebrews, in the Proverbs, in chapter 8, wisdom is God's divine daughter. And she and God create the worlds together in chapter 8. It's a beautiful passage. And the thing is that wisdom is a straight up she, more or less straight up she. I want to challenge myself on the straight up piece in a little bit. But in other words, the texts about wisdom that Paul uses and that Matthew uses and that Luke uses, that character is feminine or female, however you want to frame that really interesting question in and of itself. So this is a divine female, biblically speaking. And then the thing that basically modern and some pre-modern Christianity did is they tried really hard to forget that Sophia or wisdom was around. Now I said Sophia because that's the Greek word for wisdom. And since Paul calls Jesus wisdom, actually in Greek that reads Jesus is Sophia. That is, Paul doesn't miss the fact that he's talking about two people. He's talking about two people who he thinks are pretty divine. Not maybe like super divine, but both of them are pretty divine. And Paul, like Matthew and Luke, all three of them, as they're struggling to say that there's something divine about Jesus, their best go-to example is Sophia, or wisdom. And so this, of course, gets us started on gender for two reasons. One, some of you have known, and some of you haven't probably known, that there is a big-time female divine figure in the Bible. And the second thing is that most of you know that there's a long-term debate about how divine is Jesus. Some of you, I hope, in this session would say, not at all. Some of you, I hope, would say, altogether. And then I bet you a bunch of you would be in between in terms of how divine is Jesus. But once you say what Paul and Luke and Matthew say, as well as a whole bunch of other early Christ teachers, once you say Jesus is Sophia or Sophia is Jesus, you're in wonderfully complex gender territory already, right? In other words, the modern person will be confused. Is Jesus male or female? Or is Sophia male or female? And the first century is already completely at home with mixing that up. And I would say making that queer. That is, and queer is a very important theological term for me. It has to do with the plasticity and multiplicity of gender. So one of the main things the Gospel of Thomas knows, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, the Gospel of Thomas knows that Jesus is Sophia. Jesus is wisdom herself. I'm going to stop here, take protests, thoughts, questions.
So, my question is, this is a little bit of my pushback and my protest, only because I'm looking at on the origins of the world and secret revelations of John. Mm-hmm. Sophia, wisdom has to breathe into Jesus to give him life. So then, is he wisdom on his own, or is he wisdom because he has partnered with her, as was required in the origins of the world? Every spirit has a partner. So if we're looking at gender, is he like, for lack of a better word, hermaphrodite wisdom, or is he wisdom because his partner has breathed the enlightenment into him? That was just my question.
Stephanie, you just raised the amount of good thinking really a lot. Thank you. It's since you and because you brought, it's clear that on the origins of the world in the Nag Hammadi text, it's clear that it's because Jesus is wisdom because he's related to her. In other words, she makes him divine wisdom in that text. But I would say, for instance, Paul would kind of mail in a maybe on that question. Matthew would say that they are pretty hermaphroditic, I think, which would be a minority view, I think. And you already know, in addition, Stephanie, that there are a whole bunch of, so in other words, the discussion of Jesus as wisdom and wisdom as Jesus and Sophia is Jesus. There are a whole bunch of different opinions on that. And they know that it matters. They know that your question matters, because they want to be related to both of them. They want to know on what terms they're related to one or the other or both. So it's not any kind of joke or cute second thought that you're asking. That is that's a $64,000 question, and they're all ready to come up with their own answers.
Right. So then my question would be, if you're looking at Sophia, wisdom, and Proverbs, you're looking at the wisdom text in the Apocrypha, right? Where Solomon has this whole dialogue with wisdom, trying to pursue her and possess her. And so Sophia wisdom is already in existence prior to Jesus, right? And so what would be the motivation, right? If we're looking at gender and what's the motivation to now masculinize wisdom, or even conflate her into, she's Jesus is male and wisdom. Jesus, what's the motivation behind that?
Ooh, I'm so tempted to ask you what your answer is to that. I guess I would.
You already know my answer.
Yeah, right. But I want you to say it out loud.
I mean, of course, it's patriarchy, it's sexism. It's trying to demote feminism in the sacred text. And so if Sophia wisdom female already exists and already has this power, right? Why would you take that from her in saying that Jesus, who is now the God-man, is wisdom too?
Yeah.
Right. So.
Okay. Yeah. I for instance, I think that Paul, Matthew, and Luke all agree with you that wisdom comes before Jesus. Now, the other gospel in play that knows about Sophia is John, because John talks like Sophia in John. But there, what it seems to me that John is the first person who tries to make what you're saying, and I think I agree, is a patriarchal move. Because, in chapter 1 of John, basically, John points out the figure of logos, or the word, and knows that logos and the word is the same as wisdom. And so then John promotes Jesus back to the beginning of time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, other questions?
I have no issue with. I just want to say I have no issue with putting him back to the beginning of time. It's just the way you tell the story of how he gets to all the way to John. But
yeah.
I have no issue with that.
But I want to say that just for on your side of the point, and I'm right there too, is Proverbs, Luke, Matthew, and Paul all agree that Sophia is before the beginning. Okay, so anybody else who, so you just got in on a graduate, me taking a graduate course with Stephanie, but those of you who are not on, all in that, you want to have any thoughts, protests, or questions?
Well, I'd like to speak up here, not at the graduate level, certainly, but coming from the transgender and non-binary community, what you're talking about feels right at home in terms of a deconstruction of the gender binary, where, you know, we're talking about an idea of looking at Jesus in some ways, or Jesus and Sophia in some ways, as being gender fluid, or possibly in a transgender relationship. Not to say that that's necessarily the way it is, but I'm wondering if in the cultures of the day that Thomas was written, or in the communities that it was written in, if that might have been a metaphor that would have resonated with that culture, so that they would have understood this deconstruction, or, you know, be able to see through it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the question.
Oh, that's such a beautiful question, Anita. That's lovely. I've been working a lot on this, and I have to say I am not worthy of a good answer for you. But let me say this. There is a whole bunch of things in the early Christ movements which are buying into gender fluidity. And, you know, whether that be economic, whether that be family, whether that be in terms of thinking, there are real buy-ins in the early Christ texts, canonical and non-canonical, for gender fluidity, and so that's why I want to say, I think that the reason I'm saying that rather than a bigger picture of, let's say, the Mediterranean at that time, is because I'm stuck in being a Christian theologian, and I don't know the other stuff well enough. So I would want to say that in the stuff I know, I think that gender fluidity in terms of how much you love Jesus and Sophia and others and who they are is on the cutting edge of real communities in the first century. But you had a bigger question, and I can't quite get there because I don't want to be even more embarrassed about not knowing the rest of the Mediterranean.
Well, and I'm not sure that we could even answer that question, because I'm not sure that we have enough information about the cultures of that time to be able to really say with any definitive answer one way or the other. But what I am sort of thinking of is that there were sort of my understanding at least is in the early church, it's a very non-gender hierarchical roles, because you have a women playing, sort of taking lead in some of the early churches, which would not have been, in terms of my understanding, the norm for that time. Now, I may be wrong on that, but.
And I want to say, just to add to that, for instance, and this has only become clear, I think, in the last 20 years of New Testament studies, Paul is doing the same thing. Paul is really interested in his own gender fluidity. So, for instance, he's practically the only man, quote man, that we know in that time who is always bragging about how much he got thrown down and cast out and beat up. And so he, at the heart of when he announces himself, he shows himself to be exactly what the real men are. Well, I'm going to have one more person on Jesus, Sophia, and then get on to the other 17 verses in the Gospel of Thomas in the next 14 minutes. But Carol, are you ready to go?
Well, I was just, you mentioned logos in John, the beginning of John. I've at least always thought as logos as the word, and essentially, although the reference to is God, in a non-gendered sense.
Yeah.
I just wondered.
So the two words I want to say at that point are Philo and John. So Philo is a Jewish theologian in the first century in Egypt. And he's one of the most influential philosophers of that time. And he has realized, and what Philo does is Philo says that what Moses says and what Plato say is the same thing. And when Philo says that and explains it, here's what he says. He says that the Greek word logos, or which is the Greek word in John, the Greek word logos is a male divine figure, philosophically. And I know, Philo says, that that's basically the same person as Wisdom Sophia. Even to the point where Philo then says, and because Sophia and Logos, or wisdom and word, are basically siblings, divine siblings, they have, and this is where I disagree with Philo, but this is just to show what Philo is doing. Philo says, and I think that Sophia stays in the skies and Logos goes down to the earth. Now that is an interesting proposal, because I'm pretty sure that John doesn't think that. I think John has another way of them being divine siblings. So that would be, I would say we can, Logos in the Platonists, thinkers have already said, yes, Logos has personality. Wisdom has a persona. And he is really strong and really smart and divine. Ooh. Okay, well, so let me say some other, we've got 15 minutes left, but it's been great, folks, for me at least. So I want to tell you a couple of other things. We're going to have to talk a little bit about 114, which is the one that some of us don't know what to do with as much as we can. But I want to read also 96 and 97. I really only want to. 96 is a parable that you also know from the canonical Gospels. The realm of the Father, this text says, is compared to a woman. First of all, just say that 3 times, right? So the Gospel of Thomas is 96. The saying begins, the realm of the Father is compared to a woman. Now we're in gender territory, right? She took a little yeast and hid it in dough, and she made the loaves into leavened bread. Whoever has ears, hear. So you all mostly, or you Bible people, know that, but it's not quite as beautifully stated, I think, to be in to be genderqueer, as Thomas is when he just starts with the realm of the Father is compared to a woman. But the next one is many of you haven't heard, and is a parable very much like 96. Jesus said the realm of the Father is compared to a woman carrying a jar filled with flour. While she was walking on the road a ways out, the handle of the jar broke. The flour emptied out along the road, but she did not realize it or recognize the problem. So there, for instance, this is a parable about the kingdom of God, but it's a new one. And this says the realm of God is like, or this is the realm of the Father, the realm of God, and so that mixes the genders even more. The realm of the Father is compared to a woman who basically is shopping, coming home from shopping with her flour, and accidentally, without knowing it, spills it all. So I just want to suggest, if we could, so a lot of us are having fun with this parable for a long time, but I'm starting to really like to read it genderfully, meaning what if this is also, and not just, but what about if this is also about who we are and who God is genderless. And that says that it's about a combination of a woman, a father, and a medium-sized accident. I myself kind of would like to stay with that thought for about 3 years, gender-wise. So what if our genderness is way fuller than we think, and that we can think about it in terms of things that go wrong with us, meaning we lost the flower, and things that where we're growing into. Again, we're not getting enough done this evening, but I would call your attention to 97 in the Gospel of Thomas in terms of gender fullness. Let me see if I can get a response or a protest or something.
Hi, Hal.
Hey, Ellie.
Yeah, I would just mention I've done a bunch of work on this in connection, this particular parable in connection with the Catholic feminist hermeneutics group that I'm part of.
Mm-hmm.
And although I'm not Catholic or even Christian, but and reading it in the context of a hermeneutic of hunger and the relationship of femaleness to hunger in the ancient world, and the widows and the orphans, and really meeting that hunger face to face. And also, I don't know if you realize, Glenda Jackson just did a little article in the 4th R about reading it in the context of the folks she's worked with in Africa, and that jar, just the physicality of that jar and how that works when you have a jar on your head, and that context. But gender and hunger is a whole other topic, but that really thinking not just about gender, but real people who are gendered and the positions they are in socially, not just, that's the impact of gender in reality, is you come home to your kids with an empty jar.
And since you're a step or two ahead of us in this, Ellie, can you say a little bit more about what being in that kind of lost your flower gender moment, what that brings to us when we think about our genders?
Well, it's significant in this parable that it isn't a man with a jar.
Yeah.
It's a woman with a jar, and it doesn't have any happy ending.
Yeah.
The jar is empty. And that is what the realm of God is like, is the jar is empty. And so these disciples confronting that emptiness, absolute emptiness, is what looking into the empty jar is somehow part of the essence of really comprehending what the realm of God is.
Yeah. Oh, that's so helpful because it reminds us of how many parables actually don't turn out right. So that really gets us going. Thank you very much. I'm gonna. Some people should wisely accuse me of waiting too long to get to 114. I apologize.
We'll never get to 22?
Yes, and 22 is even better. Right? Well, you know, we can lay this whole question at the feet of Shirley and see if we should go on for 3 more sessions. Anyway, so those of you who don't have Thomas in front of you, let me just read the last saying in Thomas, which is a big gender deal. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women do not deserve life." Jesus said, "Look, I will lead her so that I might make her male, which will make her into a living spirit, resembling you males. For any woman that makes herself male will enter the realm of heaven." Anyway, so that's big time, and so you all can jump in. I want to just say 2 quick things. One, just to say that for me, the ancient Mediterranean world is by and large has one gender, and it's male. In other words, women are not people, are not full people in the ancient Mediterranean. And there is only one gender. And for this Jesus, there's clearly only one gender. I think that's where I land in explaining that. In other words, this is Jesus trying to, in his very poorly mapped out self-understanding, using the single gender of humanity to say, I'm going to help Mary. There are other positions, but this is the common way I read this. The second thing I would say is, if you would, with me or anyone else, read the 25 gender passages in Thomas, what you would see is an amazing multiplicity. And my protest, I mean, I think there are probably going to be some better answers than I just read you on 114. And you should read 22 to get about 3 other wonderful sides in the Gospel of Thomas and gender. But I think that just like most things in Thomas, it accepts and thrives on multiplicity of kinds of answers. In other words, Thomas is made for an argument, and doesn't have one argument, it has 30. And because it's a wisdom modality, it assumes that there's going to be a 117, 118, 119, 120 in this kind of, in other words, these wisdom communities and writings don't think somebody gets the last answer. So anyway, these are 2 terribly poor responses to the problem of 114. I was thinking we were going to get to 114 at about 20 of, and then we could go back to 22. So please read 22, one of the most interesting parts of Thomas and gender. Let's give the next 4 minutes to whoever can jump in there.
So I wanted to just share, sort of elaborate on what you said, Hal, in the sense that what I read about that passage, that 117 saying, is that everything is in hierarchy. And what Peter is doing is trying to save Mary by bumping her up the ladder to the male gender, because the female would be on a lower rung. So
yeah, that would be Jesus. Jesus does that.
Oh, Jesus does that. But what I'm thinking is that not letting Mary in the room reminds me of the Gospel of Mary. Mm-hmm. And the tension between Mary and Peter in that gospel, in the same way that you look at some of the sexist statements in 1 Timothy, and they seem to be a correction of the acts of Paul and Thecla and what women were doing there. And so I think, to a certain extent, this is evidence of dialogue between these writings in antiquity, perhaps, that this is maybe has the Gospel of Mary in the back of its mind and is trying to both redeem Peter and Mary to a certain extent.
Oh, that's really helpful to again see that the way we go about gender work in the big picture in all these texts is to understand the multiplicity of it. It's not just gender that's multiplicity, it's the way we need to work that has to be multiple. Other thoughts or comments, challenges?
Well, I know we're running out of time, but I have just a question that might be quick. When you made the point that there's like one gender, or that there's no gender, there's only the male gender, how is it that there's such a willingness to acknowledge a Sophia, a female deity?
I think that's a minority report. In other words, when I say it, it is the patriarchs that think there's only one gender, and so there are. It's just that the people at the top are in that stage are one gendered. But I think that there's so many ways to see that Sophia is a troublemaker, and that Paul jumps at her positively in order to make more trouble.
So what we're talking about then is different levels of the way society is thinking about gender itself, all mixed together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but then with your and my work on wisdom, I want to say the cool thing about tonight is that wisdom is multiple, not just the divine Sophia, but the process of wisdom is multiple, and the process of gender is also that. It's not the same multiple, but to lay those over gives us a lot more possibility. And it's cool that everybody's writing now what they didn't get to say.
Yeah. I want to just say that those of you who do have questions and comments and pushback, please come join us on the conversation at Early Christian Text on Facebook Conversations. There's a place there for you to write anything you want to on this subject there. So then we can all have conversation there and Hal will respond to you. Hal, do you want to say something about next month, a little teaser about what's happening next month?
Yeah, some of us have already done this once, but I'm interested in talking about the teaching of the 12 apostles, which most people who like to put other people down by using fancy Greek words is called the Didache. But I would recommend not putting other people down with your knowing Greek, but saying this book is called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles, the first, many of us think, the first handbook for early Christ people communities.
And it's going to be just as fascinating. Just want to thank you, everybody, for your participation. This was the June 22nd, 2020 Town Hall Monday Textual Studies discussion on gender creativity and problems in the Gospel of Thomas, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, the Town Hall Monday study session offers a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Dr. Hal Taussig leads each session and shares a well-framed overview of the particular text. He allows discussion participants time to share their insights as well. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are great. To donate, simply click on the Town Hall Monday Textual Studies button on the Early Christian Text homepage. You'll also find the donation button directly to Early Christian Text so that we can keep up hosting the website. Thank you so much. And our special thanks to Hal Taussig for another stimulating and wonderful discussion on the gender in the Gospel of Thomas. Thank you, Hal.
Thank you, Hal.
Thank you.